Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. What fabulous keynote speakers, huh? It really, nothing like being energized after lunch. I love that. Welcome to the Policy Track Focus on Innovation session. My name is Emily Shea. I'm the Elderly Commissioner at the City of Boston Commission on Affairs of the Elderly. So I oversee all of the kind of senior activities and programming for Mayor Walsh. I am so happy you could join us today because we have a really distinguished panel, and I think you'll find that they all come from they're all coming from kind of different backgrounds. So I think it's going to be a really interesting afternoon session. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists before they come up and speak. We've decided to keep their talking a little bit shorter because we want to have a lot of time for questions from the audience and some panel interaction because we know we just had lunch and we want to keep you awake. So as you listen to them speak, please think of some questions for them so that we can keep everyone engaged. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker for the day, Jessica Cicchino. And Jessica, did I pronounce that right? Cicchino. Yes, we should have gone over pronunciation before. Jessica is a senior research scientist at the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. She is the Institute's lead researcher on older driver safety and also conducts research on a variety of other highway safety topics, including collision avoidance technologies and the safety of pedestrians, bicyclists, child passengers, and motorcyclists. She is a member of the Transportation Research Board's Committee on the Safe Mobility of Older Persons. Prior to joining the Institute, Dr. Cicchino was a research psychologist with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. She holds a BA from Vassar College and a PhD in psychology from Carnegie Mellon University. Please join me in welcoming Jessica Cicchino.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm going to start out talking a little bit about the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, where I'm based, the work that we do, and how some of it you guys could use some of it, and a little bit about factors that lead to older drivers' crashes, with the idea that if we want to develop novel countermeasures for older drivers' crashes, we really want to zero in on the types of errors that older drivers make the most. So the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, that we abbreviate IIHS, we're a nonprofit, independent scientific research organization, and we do research on a whole bunch of different areas within highway safety. So factors pertaining to drivers and road users and different types of drivers and road users, factors pertaining to vehicles and to roadways. And we also have a sister organization called the Highway Loss Data Institute that we abbreviate as HILDI that you see up there. They share in our mission of reducing injuries and losses from traffic crashes, but they deal primarily with insurance data, and we're both supported wholly by auto insurers. And we have two locations. I'm based in our Arlington, Virginia office that's outside of Washington, D.C. And we also have our Vehicle Research Center that's in Ruckersville, Virginia, that's near Charlottesville. And out there we have a lot of land, so that's where we do our crash testing of vehicles. We have a crashworthiness rating program where we rate vehicles and how safe they are in a crash. And when we also are almost done building a giant covered track where we're going to be able to do a lot of research with collision avoidance technologies and more work with rating those. So we're excited about doing those kinds of things going forward. So to talk about factors leading to older drivers' crashes, I'm going to talk just very briefly about NHTSA's National Motor Vehicle Crash Causation Study. And so this is a really good database that has data from in-depth crash investigations from more than 5,000 crashes that were investigated throughout the U.S., and 647 of them involved drivers who were 70 and older. And so because they did these in-depth crash investigations, the crash investigators were able to reconstruct the chain of events leading up to a crash. and we were able to focus in on the critical reason for the crash, which was the final event in the causal chain leading up to the crash. And so this could be things related to vehicles, to roadways, but most often it was related to the driver. And so for drivers who were 70 and older, the most common critical reason for their crash was inadequate surveillance. And so that was looking and not seeing another vehicle or a traffic signal or failing to look. And then the next most common ones were turning in front of another vehicle while misjudging the gap between vehicles or the other vehicle's speed, a medical incapacitation, which could be passing out behind the wheel, failure to obey traffic controls or other illegal maneuvers that didn't include speeding, that was its own category, or daydreaming. So these top two, the inadequate surveillance and the gap or speed misjudgment, were significantly more prevalent among older drivers than among middle-aged drivers. And when older drivers made these inadequate surveillance errors, they did them most often because they looked but didn't see, versus middle-aged drivers did them most often because they failed to look. And for inadequate surveillance errors, older drivers of all ages made them most often while turning left at intersections, but this was even more common among older drivers. And you see the same thing for gap or speed misjudgment errors. Again, very common while turning left at an intersection, even more so among older drivers than among middle-aged drivers. And we also looked at the types of crashes that people got into, and not surprisingly, most of them were intersection crashes. But we also wanted to look at the kinds of errors that led to these other most common crash types. And so we found that when older drivers ran off the road or left their lane for any reason, and that caused their crash, that they had different reasons for those crashes than middle-aged drivers did. So if an older driver got into a crash because they ran off the road or traveled into an adjacent lane, most frequently it was because of some kind of physical factor. So that would be medical incapacitation or falling asleep at the wheel, something like that. Versus middle-aged drivers got into those kinds of crashes most often because they were distracted or because they were speeding or because they overcompensated when they were making an evasive maneuver. And so just to sum up, inadequate surveillance and the gap and speed misjudgment errors were more prevalent among older than middle-aged drivers. And so if we want to come up with countermeasures going forward to reduce crashes among older drivers, you really want to focus on diminishing the likelihood of these most common errors. And so to do that, you want to focus on countermeasures that remove left turns across traffic or make them easier to do, which we've been talking a lot about today. And so some of those that already exist would be protected left turn signals with a solid green arrow that allow drivers to turn when there's not traffic coming. And another one is converting intersections to roundabouts. But we also have evidence that when intersections are converted to roundabouts, older drivers don't like them very much, and they might go and take a different path to avoid them altogether. So we might want to think of ways to make roundabouts easier to navigate, better signage, things like that. Novel types of intersections that make it so you don't have to turn left across traffic. And one of those would be a diverging diamond interchange, which is a kind of intersection where you move over to the other side of the road briefly with traffic signals on each end. And so you can turn left when you're already on the wrong side of the road, so you don't have to turn across traffic. But again, as we have these new kinds of interchanges, we would really want to know how are older people using them and understanding them, and are they just driving in other places to avoid them if they're too complicated? And lastly, new technologies going forward, technologies that could warn you when there's oncoming traffic when you're turning left. But again, we'd want to know how older people use and accept these things as they become more prevalent. And finally, most of older drivers' crashes were intersection crashes, but about a quarter of them involved departing their lane. And we just want to keep in mind that those kinds of crashes for older drivers are due mostly to physical factors. So the kinds of countermeasures that we have now for lane departures, things like rumble strips and lane departure warning, aren't going to be as effective for older people as they are for other people. And I just want to show you on our website, IIHS.org, we have a lot of information that could be useful for people. We have a page with fatality facts that have NHTSA's FARS data for every year with grouped in different ways that you can use. We have an older driver Q&A. We have a list of state license renewal policies by state, and links to all of our research papers. And so you can check that out and find some information that might be useful to you. Thank you, that's it.
Great, thank you, Jessica. Our next speaker is Bryan Reimer, PhD. He's a research scientist in the MIT Age Lab and the Associate Director of the New England University Transportation Center at MIT. Bryan's research seeks to develop new models and methodologies to measure and understand human behavior in dynamic environments utilizing physiological signs, visual behavior monitoring, and overall performance measures. Dr. Riemer leads a multidisciplinary team of researchers and students focused on understanding how drivers respond to the increasing complexity of the operating environment and on finding solutions to the next generation of human factors challenges associated with distracted driving, automation, and other in-vehicle technologies. He's a graduate of the University of Rhode Island with a BS in Industrial Engineering, an MS in Manufacturing Engineering, and a PhD in Industrial and Manufacturing Engineering. Please join me in welcoming Bryan Reimer.
Good afternoon, everyone. And everybody's on that late afternoon siesta of too much sugar over lunch and trying to stay awake in the afternoon here. So I'll try to make this, if we get to the top here, fun and enjoyable to think about. So we heard over the keynote a little bit, Rod Medcalf from Google was here, the future of automation and automated vehicles, and the role that that may have with older adult independence and mobility in the future. It is very clear from a transportation safety perspective and a technological development perspective that higher levels of automation are rapidly evolving in the vehicle fleet. But there's a number of policy questions, especially in the older adult brand, that this is really going to bring to light. It's not a simple technology development issue anymore. So the promise, and I think Sergey from Google does the best job of it, in a quote that's a little dated right now, but it still does a reasonable job. Thinking about the time savings, the efficiencies that car sharing automation can bring, the mobility benefits to the elderly, disabled, the fact that it can exacerbate large numbers of traffic accidents and traffic fatalities. The benefits are clear. The question is, how do we get there? So one aspect is the technology, and as a society, we're enamored with looking at the latest and greatest technology. We love hearing about it on the news. We love seeing it, and we are investing an enormous amount of resources in innovating into technology development areas. But unfortunately, there are a lot of other pieces that need to fit into this equation, from how we as humans interact with the system, to how the policy aspects are going to support that, and how we're going to evolve the infrastructure around us to support a higher level of technology on the road. We're all familiar with road lines that aren't necessarily there. We adapt to them pretty well. Vision systems, on the other hand, that are looking for road lines don't make the same assumptions that we as human operators make. So if we think about vehicle automation and using the NHTSA classifications of vehicle automation, we can think about really three large buckets. The feds, as well as SAE, have subdivided things a lot further. But the reality is, from the human's perspective, there are only three buckets. The first bucket is a vehicle without automation. And we can't buy those anymore, nor are there that many on the road anymore. So from seated automotive history, with the advent and mandatory introduction of anti-lock braking systems and electronic stability control, are vehicles without automation. So many of you in the audience will probably remember the time when you got in a car and it was really difficult to turn the wheel. We didn't have power steering, automatic transmissions, all of these modern low levels of automation that exist today. The second big bucket is three levels that have been defined by NHTSA, slightly different definition by SAE, but from the human's operator, they're all the same. We have some role with the vehicle, not necessarily clearly defined, but I'm interacting as a human with the automation in some way, shape, or form. As I said earlier, vehicles we drive today do have a level of automation in them. Whether you hear the anti-lock braking systems go off, whether you're in a near crash where electronic stability control may get involved, we have a relationship with that technology. And that relationship is going to evolve significantly over the coming years. And the question is, how do we leverage the benefits of that most strategically? So unfortunately, the design factors have a mental model of technology over here, we as human operators over here, and we need to think about over the next 10 to 15 years, how do we bring those mental models together? The operator has a view of the technology that's very different. We can all think of different technologies in our lives that are much the same way. I can't figure out how to set the clock on the VCR, so I give up. Obviously, there's a mental model on why that was created from the design perspective. But if the human doesn't leverage that, we have a problem. The final is really the full self-driving automation. This is the self-driving car, the autonomous car that everybody talks about in the news. And this is far different than what we're going to see on the average consumer vehicle for some time. This is where I punch in a destination and I get from point A to point B without getting involved. Now, this may be, and this is where Google has tacked over recent time, the only really true significant change in mobility and safety and benefits. So, as we know, human error is the response of most of the accidents on the road, so if we're involved, there's a lot of suggestion that there will be a number of accidents still. So when we come out of that loop, perhaps the robots can do better than all of us, and I say perhaps. So we are seeing many of the level 2 systems beginning in production, from some of the Volvo systems to some of the Mercedes systems, and be coming right down into Cadillacs and beyond in the near future. So one of the things I think we need to think about from an older driver community and a traffic safety community in general is the concept that the future may be one of more relatively novice drivers. We are experiential learners in nature. We make decisions based upon our experiences and our learned behaviors. As we remove vehicle miles traveled, we are no longer going to be the exact same decision makers that we are today. So that says that as I drive less, I am less capable of responding to situations that occur around me. And that is one of the fallacies of all of the automated technologies that we see moving into the vehicle today, from the basics of active safety all the way on up to the more complex levels of autonomous control. The assumption is that we're capable of interacting. The reality is, from aviation and beyond, we need support, we need to learn, we need education. Trust in technology is one of the other big areas that we need to begin to think about. A lack of trust in technology, my trust is the Windows blue screen of death on the right, leads to failure to receive and effectively support the driver. So older drivers who get into a vehicle with a higher level of automation that can effectively support their mobility needs and their mobility desires, if they do not have a trust in that technology, they're going to have a hard time receiving the benefit. Fortunately today, there is no ecosystem available to develop that level of trust. We just don't develop it on our own. We need some supporting help. Overtrust leads to misuse. We see case studies on the news all the time of vehicles with higher levels of automation and YouTube videos of people beginning to abuse the technology. Yes, it's primarily associated with teen, young adult, but we will see that at the older adult side too, because when the mental model of the designers over here and the users over here, they don't match up really well. So one thing that we need to be thinking about in terms of the trust and technology issues is that it takes investment on the part of the user, the human, the operator, to learn the technologies to build that trust. It's not acquired based upon intuition alone, and it's eroded very rapidly. So if we take what is, I think, probably the most beneficial technology in the vehicle today to older adult safety, forward collision mitigation, active emergency braking systems, yeah, these are systems that can save your life in the term of a collision. But if you're not comfortable in trusting that system, we're going to see a lot of people turning them off when they still can. Argument for default on or mandatory compliance with the technologies, but we're going to take time to get there. Education. One of the myths about the impact of automation on human performance is that the investment in automation increases, less investment is needed in human expertise. It's a myth. The more complex we make the car, the more we need to educate the ecosystem that surrounds that. So that is really the push that is going to drive a need to changing the characteristics of older adult driver education in the future. It's not necessarily the type of driver education you're going to be able to learn online in the way you used to. In many senses, you need your hands on the wheel or your butt in the seat to begin to get a full understanding of what these technologies are, How do you begin to trust them, and how do you move forward? And obviously, there's a service that's going to need to fill in the gaps there. And it's not necessarily a low-cost service, but it is one that, at the end of the day, may be the key link to increased mobility, increased independence, and increased safety. So, some thoughts. Successful transition from where we are today to a more highly automated vehicles, and notice I do not use the term autonomous, highly automated, really derives some needs for policy changes. Some concepts to consider. How do we recraft driver education legislation nationally? Not state by state, nationally. The rules for educating drivers cannot be different between Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, let alone Massachusetts and California. How do we think about a national licensure system that may require tiers of operation? State right versus federal right problem, major issue. But the reality is, one state going this way, one state going that way, doesn't work anymore. There is nothing on the books in the US legislative system that prohibits self-driving vehicles or highly autonomous systems, but you have states going in different directions trying to get policy wins out of it. Defect investigation. When the designer's mental model is here, the consumer's mental model is here, what is a defect needs to be redesigned. Is it the operator's fault for not understanding the mental model of the design team, or is the designer's mental fault for not understanding the mental model of the user? There's a lot of difficulties in trying to manage that concept of what is a defect in the future. I do argue that tort reform and defining liability limits will be critical here. We may be able to reduce fatalities with higher levels of automation on the road from 30,000 Americans, 1.2 million killed globally, significantly, but it is going to change fundamentally the characteristics to those who are harmed. We as humans are not comfortable with robots harming other humans, but the reality is we need to begin to think about how to change the tort and liability system, because if we can get the number of Americans killed on the nation's roadways down by 2/3 in 10 to 15 years, that's a significant win in the right direction. So concepts to consider: a need for an ecosystem view of drivers, vehicle, and the environment as a whole. It's not the driver, it's not the vehicle, it's not the environment. It's the cohesive cooperation that needs to exist between all three. Today's distraction may be tomorrow's link to keeping people awake, alert, and engaged in the vehicle. As automation takes over, we have less attentional capacities devoted towards controlling the vehicle. Something's got to keep us engaged and alert to take over. Older adult mobility may be enhanced to the levels we strive for by looking at a balanced risk and a viewpoint of the benefits and drawbacks of new technologies. In the interim, I think the next speaker will cover a topic around Uber that I think perhaps is the near-term solution to mulch of the older driver mobility problems. Perhaps car sharing in its newest light, supported by advanced technology, can achieve some of what we want today that will take longer to develop into the vehicle ecosystem in the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Bryan. Our next speaker is Meghan Verena Joyce. Meghan is the general manager of Uber's East Coast large city operations, overseeing cities such as Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and Atlanta. She previously served as general manager of Uber Boston. Before joining Uber, Meghan worked as a senior policy advisor at the United States Treasury, specializing in financial crisis recovery and federal agency operations. Meghan also worked at Bain Capital, where she focused on tech, media, and telecom investments and strategy for several portfolio companies, including Burlington Coat Factory, Toys R Us, and Clear Channel. Meghan began her career as a consultant at Bain & Company. She's a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Business School. Please join me in welcoming Meghan.
Thank you so much for having me. Let's see if I can get this presentation teed up here. All right. So I'm just going to start briefly with a quick introduction to Uber and what Uber is and how it can be used, and then we'll get into implications for older drivers and the older community. So Uber is a software system, an app that you can download on your smartphone or computer to request a ride on demand. We have two different sides of the software system. One that are used by riders who are looking for a ride, and the other used by transportation providers in the local area who have been background checked and screened and educated on this system so that they can reliably and affordably pick up riders and transport them anywhere they need to go. All of this is facilitated by our app and technology system. So as you can see, when you first request, you'll see an ETA as to how long it will take your driver to reach you. Once you're matched with a driver, you see the driver's photo, as well as their license plate number. You can watch the car move towards you on the app. You can even send this moving image to a friend or loved one so that they can actually see your trip as it's taking place. You can pre-enter your destination so that your driver knows exactly where to go, and they're guided by the GPS that's on their side of the app. Following the ride, you then rate your ride on a series of 1 to 5 stars. You'll have the opportunity to provide open-ended feedback, and you get an email with your receipt and the record of your full trip. Likewise, the driver is able to rate their experience so that there's full accountability and transparency on both sides of the app. At this point in Boston, we have 5 different options available to riders, and these 5 options are very typical across our system. I should mention that we are in over 300 cities around the world right now, on every continent except for Antarctica. We've yet to start providing rides to penguins. But these options are pretty typical. We have UberX and UberXL, which are the standard sedan and slightly larger 7-seat versions of our more affordable product line. And then we have Uber Black and SUV, which are the sedan-sized and slightly larger 7-seat versions of our premium option. We also offer standard Boston taxis on our app. So if you prefer a yellow cab or a Hackney licensed taxi, you can request that through the app as well. And as you can see, this is an actual shot of all of the vehicles that were online on a given day in the Boston area. This has become quite a popular system over the last few years that we have grown in Boston and other cities. And at this point, its availability is quite remarkable. So this is the median wait time in minutes across several of our larger cities around the world. In Boston, you can get a ride in typically around 3 minutes throughout the greater Boston area. They're beating us in Chicago at 2.4 minutes, so it's my goal to bring that number down quite quickly. But even places like Worcester, the North Shore, the South Shore, Cape Cod, Nantucket, and Martha's Vineyard this summer, you're able to access a ride on demand through the Uber app. What makes this particularly compelling and actually feasible for someone like me is that we have been able to lower the cost over time and simultaneously increase trips per hour, thus raising earnings for drivers. And this has allowed us to push the price of an average ride down further and further over time, which has made this app more accessible to a wider group of people and broader demographics around the world. Right now, this is a trip from Beacon Hill to Fenway Park, which on our premium product is about $17. It's about $10 on a taxi, and you can do that for $5 on an UberX. And as we have found, as the price comes down, as I mentioned, a broader demographic is able to use this across a broader set of use cases. So what used to be a ride for perhaps a special occasion or an exception to the rule now becomes a way that people can get around in their day-to-day. I am very much an Uber consumer, and for me, it used to be a special occasion functionality, and now I take Uber to and from work every day. I take it to get groceries. I would have had to buy a car already in the city, and I've been able to get around without it through this system. And in fact, many people are actually finding that Uber is comparable in price to owning a car. If you drive 4,500 miles or less each year, which many city dwellers and more urban dwellers and older drivers often do, the cost of taking UberX around for all of your transportation needs can actually be comparable or less than owning a car. There are 1 billion cars on the planet right now, and 96% of the time they go completely unutilized. This is one of the most expensive assets that most of us will ever own, and it's sitting in our driveways or parking spots 96% of the time. And so if we're able to better utilize those assets through this ride-sharing concept, we can actually make that more affordable. And I think this is only really scratching the surface of affordability over the coming years with the advancement of technology and the increasing density of rides on the system. I would expect to see those prices continue to fall. What's also really exciting for me as these prices have come down is how we have been able to increase accessibility throughout these various cities and neighborhoods within these cities. So this is just a local Boston example. The map on the right-hand side shows some data from the Nelson Nygaard study that came out in late 2013, showing taxi accessibility throughout various Boston neighborhoods. And this is the percent of time that if a taxi arrived, it got to you within 20 minutes. So when you called a taxi, and if they committed to send a taxi to you and it arrived at your home, this is the percentage of time it arrived within 20 minutes across neighborhoods. And you can see the lucky riders in the Back Bay and Beacon Hill and Fenway and South End, they could typically get a ride within 20 minutes, 85, 90% of the time. However, if you were in some of the neighborhoods to the south of the city, such as South Dorchester, Rosendale, Mattapan, that number dropped quite significantly. And this only represents the percentage of time that a taxi even showed up, where reliability, anecdotally, we know, was much worse in those neighborhoods. On UberX, I'm proud to say that you can reliably get a ride throughout all of these neighborhoods. And that's what this technology has been able to do. That from the Back Bay to Mattapan, Hyde Park to East Boston, you can reliably get a car within 20 minutes. And as you saw, median time is quite closer to 3 minutes, 99% of the time. And as a result, Uber is helping make cities safer. So when people know they can get an affordable, reliable ride within 3 minutes for an average fare of around $5, $10, $15, they are more apt to request a ride when they might have otherwise in the past turned to suboptimal options. So we've done a bit of research and know that in Seattle, DUI incidents dropped 10% within the first couple years of having this option available within Seattle, the Seattle area. Likewise, taxi crime was reduced significantly in Chicago when taxi drivers started using this technology for many reasons, because there's greater accountability and transparency through the app, because there's less cash being carried around, because the payments all happen electronically through the system. This software system has enabled both riders and drivers to have a safer experience. And as a result, this has grown quickly. So over the last several years, we've been able to provide rides to over 500,000 Bostonians. Tens of thousands of drivers have been able to make money on this platform, creating the equivalent of over 4,000 jobs just in the Boston area alone, and we've taken millions of trips since then. So what does this mean for older drivers? Well, there are some really interesting and exciting experiments that we've been starting in different markets. Where we have experienced incredible growth, we're only really 5 years old as a company and only been in most cities for 1, maybe 2 years. And so we're starting to experiment here and there with some really exciting options for various different demographics and use cases, including older drivers. In one city that I oversee, Washington, D.C., we've introduced an option called Uber Assist, where we've actually partnered with a local organization that does training around people who need a bit more assistance in cars, and have produced a video that we distribute to every driver on the system. And this video actually educates drivers as to how to better serve riders who might be walking with a cane or a walker, or who might need a bit of extra time, who might have a fold-up wheelchair with them, or a service animal, and how to provide the same kind of excellent service to riders who need a bit more assistance as they do to anyone else. And the results have been quite remarkable, both in terms of the use on that Uber Assist platform and also the quality reviews that we've gotten back and feedback from both riders and drivers on the system. In another example, we've actually partnered with the local government to provide subsidized rides to people in this kind of older driver demographic. So in Gainesville, we've partnered with the local city plus elder care, where they have actually funded rides on the system. And they're able to set up a broad account to say, here's our population. We want to actually provide subsidized or free rides to people within that population by paying directly to Uber. And therefore, when those people open up their app and take a ride, they either get a discounted rate or a free ride, depending on the setup. These are all things that we can enable through our technology, and we're only really beginning to scratch the surface as to what those possibilities are in working with the older rider community, with local governments, and with organizations and businesses and hospitals and networks that serve this community. So I'm really excited to be here today. If anyone hasn't tried Uber yet, please feel free to take a free ride on us, download the app, and enter this promo code ODSS in honor of this fantastic event. And please send us your feedback. We would love to hear not only your experience with the app, but also ideas that you might have for making this platform more accessible to the older community, both with partnering with your businesses and organizations, any research that you've done, any ideas that you may have. We're an incredibly experimental organization. We're always looking for great ideas to help make this platform and product more accessible to all people, especially the people who are affected by the great work that you're doing. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Meghan. Who knew there was another conference park, huh? Aren't you glad you came? So our next speaker is Betsy Kremens. Betsy's been a senior attorney in the Elder Health and Disability Unit at Greater Boston Legal Services for over 25 years. Her elder law practice covers a wide variety of legal topics, including housing, public benefits, nursing home law, consumer issues, and cases of elder abuse and financial exploitation. In addition, she created and directs the Elder Abuse Prevention Project of the Greater Boston Legal Services, something we're thrilled to participate in at the city. She speaks frequently on elder abuse and geriatric mental health issues. She's a member of the Massachusetts Elder Advocacy Coalition, the Elder Mental Health Collaborative, the Arlington Elder Abuse Task Force, Woburn Elder Abuse Prevention Task Force, and the Cambridge Elder Abuse Prevention Coalition, the Boston Bar Association, and is a founding member of the Elder Law Project at the Women's Bar Foundation. She's a graduate of the University of Rhode Island and Boston University School of Law. Please join me in welcoming Betsy.
Thank you, Emily. Good afternoon. I am actually not going to be taking sort of a legal perspective on this because over the years, the only calls I've ever gotten regarding older drivers or older safe driving are, and I've actually gotten quite a number, are family members saying, oh, you're good, you're an elder services lawyer, how can I take my parents' car keys away? And while that's obviously can be a very important concern, it's not really a legal issue. And I'm sure for anyone who's attended other sessions today, you know that it's a very complicated and a very complex issue. So I thought I'd take a different approach today and talk about it really through what I would call an elder justice lens. Part of what I do is elder justice work, which is really just a term coined to describe work regarding elder abuse, prevention, and exploitation. And I'm not really trying to equate the two issues at all, but rather to show that the issue of safe driving for older folks can really be dealt with within a framework often used for elder justice issues. So for instance, with the elder abuse work that I do, one of the issues that comes up time and time again is the issue of capacity. People who have cognitive decline, and the issue becomes, at what point does somebody pass from being able to make their own decisions and having the autonomy to do so, and then cross some invisible line into not being able to make their own decisions anymore. And I was talking about this issue at Mass General a couple months ago, and somebody said, if you found the 50 greatest medical minds in this hospital and asked them, where's that line, you'd get 50 different answers. And I think that's absolutely true. There is no definition of capacity or where that line is. And likewise, Another issue that comes up is who decides? Who decides if somebody still has capacity? And that issue is exactly the same for driving safety. Where's the line when someone is not making decisions anymore, doesn't have the capabilities anymore to drive safely, and who decides that? And I think it was Joe Coughlin at the, when he was making the keynote, talked about people kicking this issue around. Doctors don't want to make the decision. Family members don't want to make the decision. I would clearly say it's not a legal decision, and please don't call my office. Nobody really wants to deal with the issue because it's very difficult and very complex. It involves people who have cognitive deficits. There's oftentimes family dynamics involved, physical frailty. And so the framework that we use with elder abuse issues starts with what is the issue? What are we talking about? Because I think with elder abuse, it's a complex, nuanced issue that not many people really know about in all its complexities. So if you take that and say, what's the concern? The concern is whether or not somebody can or should still be driving safely, and who's making that decision? Should that be a local decision, a community decision, an individual decision? Should there be state laws around that? And if so, what kind of state laws? We all know that, I mean, I'm teaching right now my 16-year-old son to drive, so we all know that it really doesn't matter what your age is, it really matters what your capabilities are and what your cognition is and what your vision is like, and a lot of other factors that sometimes are related to age but oftentimes aren't. So I really don't think there should be an age limit, but what should a law look like, or a host of laws look like around these issues? Likewise, the next issue is engagement strategies, and actually I think this is the most difficult issue, talking to somebody about whether or not they should continue to drive. Like with elder abuse issues, it's a really hard issue. If you're working with an older person and suspect that there's some sort of abuse going on, self-neglect, people aren't making good decisions for themselves anymore, financial exploitation, or somebody's taking advantage of them or harming them, how do you bring up the issue? And one of the reasons it's complex is, unlike child abuse, if you had a 6-year-old who was being harmed, everybody around them could say, get that child out of that situation. Well, we're not talking about children, we're talking about adults who, they're still legally, there hasn't been a declaration yet that they're not able to make their own decisions, so legally they're still able to make their own decisions, even if everyone, all the caregivers around them are thinking these really aren't good decisions anymore. Who gets to decide that? And likewise with driving, who gets to decide? And then another issue that I think is different is, and then how is that decision enforced? Because you could have a whole host of people, from law enforcement to doctors to family members to the RMV, say you can't drive anymore and take your license away, but that doesn't necessarily mean somebody's not going to drive anymore. So how do you effectively and compassionately enforce that sort of decision? Then I think the third issue is, how do we as a community support people who aren't able to use their cars anymore? Because there's plenty of research out there that talks about the isolation, the depression, the mental health issues, the increase in both morbidity and mortality that comes when people aren't able to drive anymore, especially people without a family support system or another support system where they can get rides. So what, as a community, and each community can own this issue. We don't have to have just doctors own it or just law enforcement own it. It could be owned by a community. What alternatives can each community come up with? And that obviously exists already. There's van services, there's plenty of walkable cities and a focus on making cities more, or towns more walkable. Uber, I think, is an incredibly great alternative. As a recent Uber convert myself, it's a really great, it's a wonderful product, but how do you get an older person to get into somebody else's car and it's not a taxi? And again, at the keynote, somebody talked about paying for it. I can already see my father saying, what, this guy's gonna give me a ride to the senior center and I have to pay for that? So how do you get somebody to pay for that, to convert over, to think that, wow, this really is a wonderful alternative, and if I want to go to the store, if I want to get that ice cream cone, somebody's going to be here in 3 minutes to get me, and it's going to be safe and reliable and ideally accessible, because that really is an issue for a lot of older folks. So as a community, what can we do? Because I guess just to end, I think that the alternative to safe driving can't simply be isolation or despair. There has to be something else. So when you're having the discussion during that engagement strategy period, to be able to offer viable, affordable, accessible alternatives that make sense to older folks, it would be very helpful to have more options than we have right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Betsy. Norma Moreno Cargie is our final speaker of the day. She's Vice President for Corporate Citizenship at Tufts Health Plan and President of the Tufts Health Plan Foundation. As Vice President, Ms. Moreno Cargie leads strategy, planning, and implementation of the Tufts Health Plan corporate citizenship efforts. In her role at the foundation, Ms. Moreno Cargie leads a team of community investors to advance healthy living with an emphasis on older adults in markets where Tufts Health Plan has a presence, including Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Over the past year, Ms. Moreno Cargie has advanced the foundation beyond grant making towards engagement strategies that focus on convening communities, building systems and best practices, influencing policies, and investing in community leaders and collaborations around issues facing our most vulnerable communities. Prior to joining Tufts Health Plan, Ms. Moreno Cargie served as Director of Global Corporate Citizenship at the Boeing Company, had a 6-year tenure as Vice President of Communications and Development for the Illinois Action for Children, served as Deputy Communications Director for Barack Obama's U.S. senatorial campaign, and held a variety of positions at the City of Chicago. Please join me in a welcome for Ms. Nora Moreno Cargie.
Okay, are we still awake? All right, so, no, we have someone who said no. I want to honor everyone. So I want to say I grew up and television was my babysitter. So I'm going to just share with you a little bit of television. Let me do this. All right, who watches TV here? Right? Who has a guilty pleasure of watching bad TV on occasion? Oh, fess up. Come on, every hand should be up. All right, so I'm going to share with you a little clip that I saw that I loved because it reminded me of a story that I'll tell you in a little second.
All right, Tech, that's it. You're done.
Yeah, you're right. We should probably start fresh again tomorrow morning.
No, Tag, I mean you're done with driving.
What? No, I gotta have my license, Mike. I've been driving since I'm 14. I drove a transport supply truck in the war, for God's sake.
Yeah, and America thanks you. But if you really want to serve this country now, you'll stay off its roads.
Come on, Mike, this is my life we're talking about here. My freedom. How can I give that up?
Look, Tag, I know it's not easy to hear, but you gotta trust me. This is the right decision. Tag, you asked me to help you out. I'm helping you out.
All right. I got a podiatrist appointment on Tuesday, and Pat's got water aerobics. You want to pick me up around 9?
So I want to just show you that clip because it has a lot of messages there, right? So what you didn't see at the beginning is that Mike's dad drives into a curb. No one gets hurt, but he's in the car with his dad. And what leads up to this actual scene is that his dad needs to get his driver's license renewed. And so he's asked his son to help him with that process, to get his license renewed. And you see what happens. He drives into the curb. His son realizes, and previous to this, he runs a red light. Clearly, his dad is not able to drive anymore. And so there's this poignant moment when his son says, "You asked me to help you, I'm helping you." And what do we hear? We heard him say, "Okay, well then, you have to pick me up for my podiatrist appointment and my water aerobics class. And so what it demonstrated to me was this idea that when we think about the handing over of the keys, we often don't think about what that means. And so I really loved hearing that whole conversation around isolation and what it really means when you want to have not only your older adult parent safe, but you have to think about what are the supports that you may need. And so as a foundation, I want to say that we've stepped back a little bit. Before I arrived a year and 2 months ago with a couple of days here and there, I realized that we did a lot of great investments in community, but they were discrete, sometimes isolated grants. And what we did was we stepped back and we said that we have to address the issue of healthy living with a focus on older adults in a comprehensive, community-based way. And so we adopted what we thought was a great model. The World Health Organization had standards for age-friendly communities. We heard Len allude to it a little bit earlier. And that gave us a chance to think about communities as a whole, right? This idea of housing, open space, roads, sidewalks, access to healthcare. And so we really feel that when we think about this notion of healthy living with an emphasis on older adults, it's thinking about the older adult in the context of their community. It isn't just thinking about them as a driver, although this is a very important issue. It's about thinking about them as a human being that belongs in a community, that belongs in this bigger context. And so we, as a foundation, thought that we would step back and, again, think about how we can rethink our giving. And so we thought about bucketing our investments. And so I was really glad to hear Bryan talk about policy, because we were focused on policy and advocacy, because as we think about what needs to happen around the issue of safe driving, right, we have to think about the policy changes that need to happen, and also how to support community-based advocacy so that we can really get that movement going. And so in front right here, I just want to acknowledge Ruth Palumbo, who is, I know, a stranger to no one, but a great colleague and support on the team. So policy and advocacy. We also support systems and best practices, because at the end of the day, and again, Bryan mentioned it, this idea of we can't think about, policies or laws for one state. We have to think about the system. And at the end of the day, philanthropy is just a drop in the bucket when we think about the resources that we have and the ability to change systems. We can be those risk takers, and so we think about ourselves as an organization, a foundation that can take risks around those ideas where people are coming together and saying, yes, this is something that we want to try out. And then the last bucket is what we're calling the President's Award. And this is focused on those collaborations in community where, with a little bit of additional resources or an investment in that inflection point, we really can have an impact and make a difference by that additional investment. And so I just want to say that it's an honor for me to be here, to just hear some of the ideas that are being, tossed around, and also to say that, our work, the work that we do, we can't do it alone. We have to really think about how we come together, collaborate, and really think about the impact. The story that I wanted to share with you about that clip, when I saw it, I thought, early on, I think it was, so when you were talking about the research, right, and what it showed, the idea of like, what are you seeing around, I want to say that the first time I was in an automobile accident, I was 12. So age didn't matter. It really didn't matter. And the idea of not understanding where I was really palpable to me. And even in remembering and seeing that clip, I thought to myself, how can we think about our safe communities in a more comprehensive and inclusive way. And so when we think about age-friendly, and we really appreciate Emily's leadership around this work in Boston, that we have to think about something that is accessible and universal for everyone who lives in community. So thank you.